After 8 years of doing the work above my title, my boss told me I still wasn't ready to lead, then handed the promotion to his friend's son. I submitted my resignation that afternoon and canceled it the moment corporate compliance mentioned Monday. By 8:10 Thursday morning, the office smelled of burnt coffee, warm printer paper, and the lemon cleaner the night crew used on the conference tables. After 8 years there, I knew the building almost like a living thing. The elevator's tired hum, the copier that jammed when someone got ambitious, the sudden silence whenever an executive crossed the floor. I also knew our clients, contracts, vendor problems, and all the little operational disasters that somehow found their way to my desk. That morning, I carried a notebook into Mark's office, expecting good news. I had spent 6 months competing for the operations manager promotion, survived 3 interview rounds, presented a detailed improvement plan, and had already been doing much of the job whenever Mark needed someone dependable. 50 words into our meeting, he closed the door and said, "Rachel, you're excellent at what you do, but we don't think you're ready for leadership." I stared at him, waiting for the explanation that could make that sentence logical. During the previous year alone, I had trained 3 employees, managed major vendor issues, handled client escalations, and covered Mark's responsibilities during his 6-week absence. Apparently, I was qualified to carry leadership when it was heavy, just not to have the title when it came with a salary. "What am I missing?" I asked. Mark leaned back and offered phrases that sounded impressive until you tried to measure them. Executive presence, strategic maturity, the ability to command a room. I nodded slowly. "Who got the position?" A tiny hesitation. "Evan Mercer." That name changed the temperature of the room. Evan didn't work for our company. He was 27, had limited operations experience, and I had seen him in the office only twice. Both times he had gone straight to Mark. Once, Mark had introduced him as the son of an old friend. I asked when Evan had interviewed. "His process was handled differently," Mark replied. Differently. A wonderfully flexible word when nobody wants to say what actually happened. Back at my desk, I opened the internal posting. The role required 5 years of operational experience, cross-functional project leadership, and knowledge of our compliance procedures. I had all 3. Evan, from everything available internally, did not. More strangely, the posting had closed 11 days before its original deadline. My interview documents were there, including panel scores and presentation notes, but I couldn't find an equivalent panel record for Evan. Then I noticed an old scheduling thread attached to the hiring folder. Mark had written to another manager, "Evan should be an easy fit. I'll make sure the paperwork catches up." I didn't download it or forward it anywhere. I simply sat there looking at the sentence while the normal Thursday noise continued around me. Phones rang. Someone argued with the printer. 2 people laughed near accounting. Nothing dramatic happened, yet the promotion no longer felt merely unfair. It felt arranged. After lunch, Mark walked Evan through the department before any official announcement had reached us. Evan wore a navy suit and the careful smile of someone trying to look comfortable in a room full of people who knew more than he did. When they reached my desk, Mark slapped a hand lightly against the divider. "Rachel is going to be your best resource. She knows this operation inside out." Evan smiled and offered his hand. "Great! I've heard I'll probably be leaning on you a lot." I shook it politely. That was the whole deal in one sentence. He would receive the promotion while I taught him how to perform it. "I know the systems," I said, "and where the records are." Mark's expression shifted for an instant before the smile returned, small enough to miss if I hadn't spent 8 years reading his moods. I already had another job offer, so that afternoon I printed the resignation notice I had prepared earlier in the week. When I handed it to Mark, he read it without asking what the company could do to keep me. "I was afraid you'd take the promotion decision personally," he said. I almost admired the irony. Instead, I told him my final date. Mark nodded and immediately said, "Then let's prioritize transferring your knowledge to Evan." Even my departure had been converted into free training for the man replacing me. I returned to my desk, opened a transition folder, and began organizing the work I had spent years building. I felt strangely calm. I had another opportunity waiting. My notice was submitted, and Mark had made his choice. As far as I was concerned, the story was over. At 4:47 p.m., corporate compliance sent an email. The subject was Independent Audit, Records Preservation Notice. Selected employees were instructed to preserve hiring documentation, management correspondence, conflict of interest disclosures, email evidence, approval histories, and contract records. Nothing relevant could be deleted, altered, or removed from company systems. The independent audit would begin Monday morning. I read the message again as the office emptied around me, and evening light stretched across the carpet. Hiring documentation, conflict of interest, management correspondence. 3 ordinary categories that suddenly felt remarkably specific. Mark's sentence came back to me. "I'll make sure the paperwork catches up." Then the shortened application window, the missing interview record, Evan's connection to Mark. I didn't know what compliance had found, and I wasn't going to invent conclusions they hadn't reached. But leaving before the audit now seemed less like moving on and more like disappearing at exactly the wrong moment. I opened a new email to HR and withdrew my resignation. No accusations, no threats, no triumphant speech. I simply stated that I would remain in my current role and was formally canceling my notice. Then I clicked send and shut my laptop. Outside the windows, the last sunlight reflected off the neighboring buildings like sheets of copper. Monday was 3 days away. Mark still believed his biggest problem was replacing me with Evan. He had no idea an independent auditor was about to start reading the paperwork. Monday arrived under a gray sky, with rain tapping against the office windows hard enough to blur the buildings across the street. I was at my desk by 8:05, and Mark was already in his office, unusual for a man who treated 9:15 like an ambitious target. His door kept opening and closing. HR went in, then someone from legal. At 8:32, 2 people I had never seen before stepped off the elevator carrying laptops and slim black document cases. They didn't look dramatic. No badges flashed, no voices rose. They simply introduced themselves as representatives of the independent audit team and asked for a conference room. Somehow, their calm made the atmosphere worse. 10 minutes later, Mark appeared beside my desk. "Rachel, can we talk?" His tone had changed since Thursday. The confidence was still there, but now it had a crack running through it. Inside his office, he shut the door and asked why I had canceled my resignation. "I reconsidered," I said. "Is there a problem?" He studied me. "The timing is interesting." I almost smiled. So was the promotion. He didn't appreciate that. Mark reminded me that Evan's appointment was final and warned me not to let personal disappointment affect the transition. Then he asked whether I had recently reviewed hiring records. That question was far more interesting than anything else he had said. I answered carefully. I accessed records required for my work and followed the preservation notice from compliance. His jaw tightened. Did you send anything outside the company? No. Print anything? No. Discuss anything with the auditors? They haven't asked me anything yet. Each answer seemed to disappoint him in a different way. He wanted something he could call misconduct, and I wasn't giving it to him. When I returned to my desk, Evan was waiting with a notebook. He wanted me to explain our contract approval process before his first management meeting. I walked him through the basic workflow, but within 15 minutes it became clear he didn't understand why certain vendor changes required compliance review. Can't we just approve these at department level? He asked. Not above the threshold, I said. That creates an audit exception. His pen stopped. Mark said we've always had flexibility. Before I could answer, one of the auditors appeared at the end of our row and asked to speak with me privately. The interview took place in a small conference room where the air conditioning was cold enough to make the glass table feel like ice. The auditors introduced themselves, explained that they were reviewing several internal processes, and told me to answer only what I personally knew. That suited me perfectly. They asked about vendor approvals first, then reporting procedures, then hiring practices. Eventually, one auditor turned his laptop toward himself and asked, "Were you a candidate for the operations manager position?" I said yes. "How many interviews did you complete?" 3. "Were you informed that the application period had been shortened?" No. He wrote something down. Then came the question that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Were you ever asked to participate in an interview or skills assessment involving Evan Mercer? I told him I wasn't. He exchanged a glance with his colleague. Not shock, not triumph, just confirmation of something they were already examining. They asked whether I knew of any relationship between Evan and Mark. I repeated exactly what Mark had once told me. Evan was the son of an old friend. Nothing more. No assumptions, no accusations. Facts were doing enough work without my help. When I returned, the department had gone unnaturally quiet. Mark was standing inside Evan's new office, speaking in a low voice. Through the glass, I saw Evan shake his head, then glance toward me. A few minutes later, Mark sent an email to the entire team, reminding everyone that audit matters were confidential and that speculation can damage professional reputations. It was almost elegant. Nobody had publicly accused anyone of anything, yet Mark was already defending reputations. Then corporate compliance requested access to the original recruitment timeline, interview scoring sheets, conflict of interest declarations, and authorization records connected to Evan's hiring. I was copied because several documents had passed through the operations archive I maintained. While locating the requested folders, I noticed something I hadn't seen Thursday. One approval form listed a review date 3 days after Evan's selection had already been entered into the system. Another document referenced an interview panel, but the names of the panel members were blank. I didn't interpret either record. I simply provided the originals through the approved compliance channel. By late afternoon, the office felt like a room waiting for thunder. Evan had stopped asking me about contract procedures. Mark had canceled 2 meetings and spent nearly an hour with HR. At 4:18, an executive assistant entered his office and closed the door behind her. 5 minutes later, Mark emerged without his jacket, crossed the floor, and asked Evan to join him upstairs. Neither looked at me. My inbox chimed almost immediately afterward. The audit team wanted a second interview Tuesday morning, this time concerning email correspondence and hiring approvals. I read the request once and accepted the meeting. 8 years in that company had taught me something Mark apparently underestimated. Records don't get nervous, change their stories, or suddenly remember events differently. They just sit quietly until someone asks the right question. As I packed my bag, another message appeared from corporate compliance. It was only 2 sentences long. Certain management access to hiring records had been temporarily restricted while the review continued, and employees were instructed not to alter any documentation connected to the operations manager selection. Whatever the auditors had found on Monday, they weren't finished. If you've ever watched someone get the title while someone else did the work, subscribe and tell me in the comments, would you have stayed for the audit or walked away? Alternative, if you were Rachel, would you trust the process and stay, or take the new job and leave Mark behind? Drop your answer below and subscribe for more workplace stories like this. Alternative, 8 years of loyalty, 1 stolen promotion, and now an independent audit. If you want to see where this goes, subscribe and tell me what you would have done in Rachel's place. On screen, would you stay for the audit or leave? Tuesday morning, Mark's office was dark. His name was still on the glass, his jacket still hung behind the door, but his chair was empty. At 8:40, HR sent a short message saying he would be unavailable during the ongoing review and that department approvals would temporarily go through Senior Operations Director Helen Carter. Nobody used the word suspended. Nobody needed to. Evan arrived 10 minutes later, looking as though he had slept in his suit. He walked directly into his office, closed the blinds halfway, then reopened them almost immediately. At 9 o'clock, I went downstairs for my second audit interview. This time, 3 people were waiting, the 2 auditors from Monday and a corporate compliance attorney. A folder sat in the middle of the table. The attorney opened it and asked, "Rachel, do you recognize this email chain?" I did. It was the same thread where Mark had written that Evan was an easy fit and that he would make sure the paperwork caught up. But now I could see the earlier messages. The chain had started nearly 3 weeks before my final interview. Mark had asked HR whether the experience requirement could be treated as flexible for a candidate he wanted considered. HR had replied that exceptions required written justification and conflict of interest disclosure if a personal relationship existed. The auditors asked whether I had ever seen such a disclosure. No, I said. They didn't tell me whether one existed. Instead, they moved to another record, a calendar invitation for an interview panel supposedly held on a Friday afternoon. My name appeared among the expected participants. "Were you at this meeting?" one auditor asked. I looked at the date. That Friday, I had been in another building presenting quarterly vendor results to finance. My calendar showed it. No, I wasn't even on this floor. The attorney made a note. Then she asked if I had authorized anyone to use my name as part of Evan's assessment. I hadn't. That was the first moment the situation stopped feeling like favoritism dressed in corporate language. Someone had created a record suggesting a hiring step had occurred in a way I knew it hadn't. When I returned upstairs, Helen was waiting beside my desk. She asked me to join her in Mark's office, which felt strange enough before she sat in his chair. Until further notice, I'm overseeing the department, she said. You are not responsible for training Evan beyond your normal duties. That single sentence removed a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Then she asked me to review active contract deadlines because several approvals were being rechecked. We spent the next hour going through vendor renewals and pending changes. Halfway through, Helen stopped at one contract and frowned. The approval history showed Mark had authorized an exception that should have gone through compliance. Attached to it was a warning email I had sent months earlier explaining exactly that. Did he respond? Helen asked. He told me verbally that he'd handle it. She searched the folder and found no follow-up. Another ignored warning. Not explosive by itself, but it fit an uncomfortable pattern. Rules became optional whenever they slowed Mark down. Just before lunch, Evan appeared at my desk. For the first time since arriving, he didn't sound like my new manager. Did you know about this audit before I accepted? He asked quietly. No. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mark told me the hiring process was complete. I believed that Evan believed him, which complicated the anger I had been carrying. Nepotism had opened the door for him, but that didn't necessarily mean he knew how many rules Mark had bent to hold it open. Then answer whatever they ask you truthfully, I said. Evan nodded and walked away. There was no satisfaction in watching him realize the title he had proudly accepted might have been built on paperwork he'd never seen. Office victories rarely come with triumphant music. Mostly, they come with uncomfortable silences and people staring too long at their screens. At 3:30, Helen called the department into the main conference room. Rain had finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked and the city outside unusually bright. She kept the announcement brief. The operations manager appointment was being placed under administrative review. Evan would not exercise managerial authority while that review continued, and all hiring-related questions were to go through HR. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then laptops opened and everyone returned to work with exaggerated concentration. Evan stayed seated after the others left. I gathered my notebook and headed for the door, but Helen asked me to remain. Once we were alone, she slid a printed agenda across the table. At the top were 4 words I hadn't expected to see so soon. Special Board Review, Wednesday. They've expanded the investigation, she said. You may be asked to provide operational context. I looked through the glass wall toward Mark's empty office. 2 days earlier, he had been worried that I might take a denied promotion personally. Now, the board wanted to understand how that promotion had happened at all. Wednesday began with sunshine so sharp it made the rain-streaked windows look cracked. By 9 o'clock, the executive floor had become a quiet procession of dark suits, closed doors, and assistants carrying folders between conference rooms. The special board review started upstairs, while the rest of us were expected to work normally, which was almost funny. Nobody was working normally. At 10:15, Helen appeared beside my desk and said, "They're ready for you." The boardroom was colder than the audit room, and twice as large. 7 people sat around a polished table, joined by corporate compliance, legal, and the independent auditors. Mark sat near the far end. It was the first time I had seen him since Monday. He looked composed until I entered. Then his eyes dropped to the folder in front of him. The questions were precise. How long had I worked in operations? 8 years. Had I performed management duties during Mark's absences? Yes. Had I trained employees, handled escalations, and maintained contract records? Yes. Then one board member asked about the promotion process. I explained my 3 interviews, presentation, and panel assessment without mentioning whether I deserved the job. That wasn't the issue anymore. An auditor displayed the hiring timeline. Evan had been identified as Mark's preferred candidate before my final interview was completed. His experience exception had been requested before the posting closed, and the conflict of interest disclosure HR had specifically requested was missing from the official file. Mark interrupted. Evan was recommended because he had potential. That isn't prohibited. The compliance attorney answered calmly. Potential isn't under review. Procedure is. The room went silent. There was something almost surgical about the sentence. Then came the email evidence. Mark's messages showed repeated attempts to accelerate Evan's hiring, followed by requests to complete documentation after key decisions had already been made. The supposed interview panel record included my name, despite my being elsewhere that afternoon. Another manager listed on it had already confirmed he never attended either. Mark argued that an administrative assistant must have used a preliminary attendee list by mistake. That explanation might have survived alone. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't alone. The auditors presented contract exceptions, ignored compliance warnings, and approval records showing the same habit. Make the decision first, repair the process later. One of my emails appeared on the screen, a warning I had sent months earlier about a vendor approval exceeding department authority. Mark had replied only, "Noted, I'll handle it." The required review never happened. Nobody needed me to dramatize anything. 8 years of careful emails were speaking in a voice much louder than mine. The board asked me to step outside while they questioned Mark privately. I waited in a small lounge overlooking the city, watching traffic move far below like colored beads on wire. Evan was sitting near the elevators. He looked up when I approached. "They interviewed me this morning," he said. He admitted Mark had told him the role was basically his before the application period ended. Evan said he assumed that meant Mark was confident, not that the selection had already been shaped around him. "I should have asked more questions," he said. I didn't disagree. I also didn't attack him. "You can't change what happened," I said. "You can decide whether you're honest about it now." He nodded. For the first time, he looked less like the man who stole my promotion and more like someone discovering that a favor can become a trap when the paperwork arrives. At 2:20, Mark walked out of the boardroom, accompanied by HR. He wasn't carrying his laptop. They entered his office downstairs, remained there for 12 minutes, then left with a small cardboard box containing his personal belongings. No announcement followed immediately. No security spectacle. No public humiliation. Just a manager who had controlled our department on Monday, crossing the lobby on Wednesday without stopping at anyone's desk. An hour later, Helen called us together. Mark had been removed from management duties pending the final outcome of the investigation. Evan's appointment remained suspended, and the company would conduct a formal review of the promotion process. Nobody applauded. I was glad they didn't. This wasn't a movie scene where the villain disappeared and everyone suddenly became family. We still had clients waiting, contracts due, and a department that had spent 3 days discovering how much damage one person could hide behind ordinary procedures. As people returned to their desks, Helen asked me to stay. "The board reviewed your performance records," she said. "They also reviewed the original candidate assessments." My stomach tightened, but I kept quiet. She placed a sealed HR folder on the table without opening it. "They want to correct what happened," she continued, "but they're going to do it properly." For 8 years, I had watched shortcuts reward the person willing to take them. Now, for once, the company was slowing everything down, and that might have been the best sign yet. By Thursday morning, Mark's name was gone from the department calendar. At 9:20, Helen asked me to come upstairs, and this time there were no auditors waiting. Just Helen, HR, and one board representative. A thin folder rested on the table. "The review is complete," Helen said. The company had confirmed multiple procedural violations in Evan's hiring, including an undisclosed conflict of interest, unsupported exceptions to the job requirements, and inaccurate interview documentation. Mark had also ignored earlier compliance warnings involving contract approvals. His removal from management was permanent. HR would handle the rest privately. I didn't ask for details. I already had the only answer that mattered. The rules I had spent years following suddenly mattered to the people who could enforce them. Evan's promotion was formally reversed. He would not remain operations manager, though the company offered him the chance to apply for another position through the normal hiring process. Before leaving the conference room, the board representative turned to me. "There's another issue we need to correct." HR reopened the original candidate evaluations. My scores were still there: leadership assessment, operational knowledge, project results, team feedback. Nothing needed to be invented or rewritten. Helen slid a letter across the table. "We'd like to offer you the operations manager position." For several seconds, I just looked at it. 8 years of late nights, emergency calls, difficult clients, training new hires, and being told I lacked executive presence had been reduced to a clean white page with the title printed near the top. I didn't accept immediately. I asked about reporting structure, authority, salary, and compliance safeguards. Helen smiled slightly. "Those are exactly the questions we hoped you'd ask." This time, I negotiated before signing. The news reached the department that afternoon. There was no grand announcement and no applause around my desk. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Evan stopped by before leaving and wished me luck. "For what it's worth," he said, "you should have gotten a fair shot the first time." "So should everyone," I replied. We shook hands, and that was enough. My victory didn't require humiliating him. The real problem had never been one inexperienced candidate. It was a manager who believed friendship could replace procedure, and paperwork could be repaired after the fact. On Friday morning, I entered the manager's office carrying the same notebook I had taken into Mark's office 1 week earlier. The room looked smaller from this side of the desk. Sunlight fell across the carpet, phones were already ringing outside, and someone was once again fighting with the copier. Nothing about the office looked transformed, but my name was on the door. I had almost left because one man decided I wasn't ready to lead. Instead, I stayed long enough for the truth to reach the people who needed to see it. And I never had to break a single rule to make that happen.